If you look at a photograph of a typical street scene from the 1950s, or watch a vintage television commercial from that era, you will immediately notice something striking about the women. Their waists were remarkably small, their silhouettes were cinched and tailored, and the prevalence of what we would today classify as overweight or obese was statistically microscopic compared to modern numbers. It is incredibly easy to look back at this era through a modern lens and dismiss their figures as the result of restrictive corsetry, impossible beauty standards, or a bygone era of unattainable genetics. But if you strip away the girdles and the full skirts, you uncover a fascinating reality. The women of the 1950s were not starving themselves. They were not counting macros, drinking detox teas, or spending hours on a treadmill. In fact, most of them would have looked at you with utter confusion if you had asked them about their diet plan, because they did not have one. Instead, they lived by a set of silent, unspoken rules that governed their daily lives. These rules were not written in a weight loss book, and they were never marketed as a wellness regimen. They were simply the byproduct of a specific time, a specific economy, and a specific cultural mindset that history has largely forgotten. To understand why women of this era rarely struggled with their weight the way modern women do, we have to look at the very foundation of how they interacted with food. The first, and perhaps most powerful silent rule, was the rigid architecture of the daily meal. In the 1950s, the concept of grazing did not exist. Eating was not a continuous activity that filled the gaps between tasks. There were 3 distinct, defined meals a day, and eating outside of those parameters was highly unusual. Breakfast was typically a modest but structured affair, often involving a protein like an egg, a piece of toast, and perhaps a small glass of juice or coffee. Lunch was a lighter meal, frequently a simple sandwich or a bowl of soup. Dinner was the main event, a sit-down family affair where a protein, a vegetable, and a starch were served in reasonable proportions. Between these meals, the kitchen was essentially closed. There were no pantries stocked with bags of chips, boxes of cookies, or granola bars waiting to be opened at the first sign of a mid-afternoon slump. If a woman wanted a snack, she had to actively prepare it. She could not simply rip open a plastic wrapper. She might slice an apple, peel a carrot, or perhaps make a piece of toast. Because snacking required effort and planning, it was rarely done purely out of boredom or emotional necessity. This built-in friction meant that women naturally gave their digestive systems long periods of rest between meals. They did not keep their insulin levels constantly elevated by nibbling on highly processed carbohydrates throughout the day. Their bodies knew the rhythm of feast, fast, and feast again, a rhythm that kept their metabolism functioning efficiently and their waistlines naturally controlled. The second silent rule was deeply tied to the nature of the food itself. The 1950s was a transitional decade for the American and Western diet. While the post-war boom did introduce some convenience foods, the vast majority of what a family ate was still cooked from raw, whole ingredients. A housewife in 1955 did not buy a prepackaged meal that contained a list of 30 ingredients she could not pronounce. She bought flour, sugar, butter, eggs, fresh cuts of meat, and seasonal vegetables. She baked her own cakes, roasted her own chickens, and boiled her own potatoes. While we might look at a 1950s recipe for a meatloaf or a pie and gasp at the amount of butter or lard used, we must understand how those calories functioned in the body compared to modern food. Whole, real food, even when it is rich in fat or sugar, triggers a complex cascade of satiety hormones in the body. When you eat a piece of homemade cake made with real butter, fresh eggs, and refined sugar, your brain registers the fat, the protein, and the carbohydrates, and it eventually sends a signal that you are full. Modern ultra-processed foods, however, are engineered in laboratories to bypass these natural satiety signals. They use synthetic emulsifiers, artificial flavors, and highly refined industrial oils that literally trick the brain into continuing to eat. The women of the 50s did not have to battle against food scientists who were actively trying to make their products addictive. They ate real food, and because real food is heavy and satisfying, they naturally ate less of it. They stopped when they felt full, not because they possessed superhuman willpower, but because their bodies were actually receiving the nutritional signals required to turn off the hunger mechanism. This brings us to the third silent rule, which revolves around portion control, but not in the way we practice it today. Today, portion control is a conscious, agonizing mathematical exercise. We weigh our food on digital scales, we measure our rice in exact cup sizes, and we agonize over serving sizes printed on the back of a box. In the 1950s, portion control was entirely environmental and visual. The standard dinner plate was significantly smaller than the massive platters we use in modern restaurants and homes today. A typical 50s dinner plate was around 9 inches in diameter. When you place a piece of chicken, a scoop of potatoes, and a serving of green beans on a 9-inch plate, it looks like a generous, satisfying meal. If you put that exact same amount of food on a modern 12-inch plate, it looks pitifully small, and psychologically, you feel deprived before you even take the first bite. Furthermore, the culture of the dinner table dictated how much was consumed. Food was plated in the kitchen and brought to the table. Serving dishes of excess food were rarely left sitting on the table to tempt people into second helpings. If you wanted more, you had to physically get up, go back into the kitchen, and serve yourself again. The friction of this action was usually enough to stop someone from overeating out of pure habit. Additionally, there was a widely accepted cultural norm of leaving a little bit of food on your plate. Being a member of the Clean Plate Club was sometimes encouraged for children, but for adults, particularly women, leaving a bite or two behind was considered a sign of refinement and moderation. It was a silent, physical way of demonstrating that you were not gluttonous, that you were in control of your appetite, rather than being controlled by it. The fourth, and perhaps most physically demanding silent rule, was the sheer volume of non-exercise activity thermogenesis, or NEAT, that was built into every single day. We often hear that people in the past were more active, and we immediately picture them at the gym or going for jogs. But women in the 1950s did not go to gyms. Jogging was not a popular activity, and boutique fitness classes did not exist. Their physical activity was entirely woven into the fabric of their daily domestic responsibilities. Managing a home in an era without modern conveniences was an incredibly strenuous, physically demanding job. Think about the physical mechanics of a 1950s morning. Floors were not cleaned by a robotic vacuum that you control with your smartphone. They were scrubbed on hands and knees, or pushed with a heavy mechanical sweeper that required upper body strength to maneuver. Laundry was not tossed into a high-efficiency machine that does everything at the push of a button. It was a multi-day physical ordeal, involving heavy tubs of water, wringers that required immense grip strength, hanging heavy wet sheets on a clothesline in the backyard, and carrying baskets up and down stairs. Ironing was not done with a lightweight steam iron for 10 minutes. It was an hours-long chore involving heavy cast-iron irons that had to be heated on a stove or a specialized ironing board, pressing the wrinkles out of cottons and linens that were prone to severe creasing. Beyond the chores inside the house, daily life required walking. Suburban layouts were different, and the car was not the extensions of the human body that it is today. Women walked to the grocery store, carrying heavy paper bags back home. They walked their children to the local park. They walked to the butcher, the baker, and the drugstore. A modern fitness tracker would easily clock a 1950s housewife at 10 to 15,000 steps a day, entirely without her ever putting on a pair of athletic shoes or breaking a dedicated sweat. This constant, low-level movement kept their muscles engaged, their blood flowing, and their caloric burn consistently elevated. They did not need to carve out an hour for a workout because their entire life was a workout. The fifth silent rule was the psychological and emotional relationship these women had with food. Today, food is heavily emotional. We eat to celebrate, we eat to cope with stress, we eat out of boredom, and we eat for comfort. Food marketing constantly targets our feelings, telling us we deserve a treat, that we have earned a break, that a certain chocolate bar will make us happy. In the 1950s, while food was certainly a source of family joy and togetherness, it was not viewed as a primary tool for emotional regulation. The cultural narrative around food was much more pragmatic. Food was viewed primarily as fuel for the body and as a duty of the homemaker to provide for her family. A woman in this era did not look into her refrigerator to find her identity, her self-worth, or a solution to a bad day. If she was stressed, she did not automatically reach for a pint of ice cream, because that behavior had not yet been normalized by decades of advertising and cultural shift. Food was respected, but it was kept in its proper place. It was something you consumed at specific times to sustain your physical body, and then you moved on with your day. This emotional detachment from food meant that women were not constantly battling the urge to emotionally eat. They ate when they were physically hungry, and they stopped when they were physically full. The modern epidemic of mindless eating, consuming an entire bag of chips while staring at a screen without even tasting it, was virtually non-existent because the environment did not facilitate it, and the cultural mindset did not permit it. This environmental control is the sixth silent rule, and it is arguably the most important. We like to believe that our weight is entirely a matter of personal willpower. We tell ourselves that if we just try hard enough, we can resist the lure of the modern food environment. But the women of the 1950s prove that willpower is largely a myth when you are not constantly forced to use it. They lived in an environment that inherently supported a healthy weight. There was no fast food on every corner. There were no vending machines in every office building and school hallway. The grocery store did not have aisles dedicated to hyper-palatable snack foods engineered to keep you eating. You could not order a 1,000-calorie meal to your front door in 20 minutes with a few taps on a smartphone. Because the temptation was not constantly in their faces, they did not have to exhaust their mental energy resisting it. They did not experience the decision fatigue that plagues modern dieters. Today, we wake up and we have to actively choose not to eat the donuts in the break room. Actively choose not to grab a frappuccino on the way to work. Actively choose not to order a pizza for dinner because we are too tired to cook. By the end of the day, our willpower is entirely depleted and we cave. The 1950s woman did not face these micro-decisions every hour of her life. Her environment made the healthy choice the easiest choice, and often the only choice. We must also acknowledge the unspoken social pressures of the era, which acted as a powerful, silent seventh rule. The 1950s was a highly conformist society. While women were not explicitly told they needed to look like supermodels, there was an intense societal pressure to be neat, put together, and to fit into the standardized mold of the ideal housewife. Gaining a significant amount of weight was not just viewed as a health issue, it was seen as a failure of self-care, a loss of personal discipline, and a violation of social norms. Husbands, peers, and even doctors would openly comment on a woman's weight in ways that would be considered incredibly rude and intrusive today. This social pressure, while undeniably toxic and anxiety-inducing by modern psychological standards, served as a relentless, silent watchdog over a woman's daily habits. It made her hyper-aware of her appearance and her consumption. It is important to recognize this not to glorify the sexism of the era, but to understand the full picture of why they stayed thin. They were highly motivated by the fear of social judgment, the desire to fit into the tailored, cinched-waist clothing of the era, and the desire to avoid the stigma of being a heavy wife kept many women subconsciously vigilant about their portion sizes and their snacking habits. It was a negative motivator, but a highly effective one. It is also vital to address the things history often gets wrong about this era, namely the reliance on cigarettes and diet pills. Yes, it is absolutely true that smoking was rampant in the 1950s, and nicotine is a known appetite suppressant. Yes, doctors did prescribe amphetamine-based diet pills to housewives who struggled with their weight. However, to attribute the general slimness of an entire generation of women solely to stimulants is historically inaccurate and intellectually lazy. While a subset of women utilize these dangerous methods, the vast majority of women simply did not. The average housewife was not popping amphetamines every morning. She was drinking her coffee, scrubbing her floors, and cooking her roast. The silent rules of their environment and lifestyle were more than enough to keep the majority of the female population naturally slender. The cigarettes and pills were exceptions and extreme measures, not the foundational cause of the era's silhouette. When we look back at the women of the 1950s and wonder why they never got fat, we are looking at a perfect storm of circumstantial factors that can never be perfectly replicated. We cannot, and should not, go back to the rigid gender roles, the lack of modern conveniences, or the intense social conformity of that era. But we can look at their silent rules and extract the fundamental wisdom that modern science is only now beginning to prove. We can learn that an environment filled with hyper-processed, lab-engineered food will inevitably defeat human willpower. We can learn that incorporating natural, physical movement into our daily lives, standing more, walking more, doing our own chores, is far more effective for long-term weight management than punishing ourselves in a gym for an hour a day. We can learn that eating real, whole food, prepared from scratch, naturally controls our appetite in a way that diet foods never will. We can learn that creating boundaries around when and where we eat, such as keeping food out of sight and avoiding constant snacking, allows our bodies to function the way they were designed to. The women of the 1950s did not know about insulin resistance, leptin levels, or the glycemic index. They did not need to know. They simply lived in a way that aligned perfectly with human biology. They ate real food at regular intervals. They moved their bodies continuously through the natural demands of their day, and they lived in an environment that did not constantly tempt them to overeat. Their diet rules were silent, because they were not rules at all. They were just life. And perhaps the greatest lesson we can learn from them is that when you fix your environment and your daily habits, the issue of weight takes care of itself, quietly and naturally, without you ever having to utter the word diet at all.